Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, and I want to thank everyone for being here tonight in the Community Alliance and everyone for coming out on, now is this an average fall day or, because I'm not from around here, so you have to tell me. No, but it is cold, but it's beautiful, and more importantly, the people have just been very, very nice ever since I got here. So I want to thank everyone for putting this on tonight. You know, I thought it was especially fitting that we started with watching Reefer Madness, the 1930s film that was funded actually by a nonprofit and then distributed through churches and ways at that time, because unfortunately that is the impression that a lot of people have about marijuana today. What I mean by that is not that many people today believe Reefer Madness. Actually, they believe the opposite. They think that anything the government puts out about marijuana, or really anything anyone says negative about marijuana, must be Reefer Madness. And it's sort of biased a lot of people today from actually hearing what the science really says. And that's why I actually named my book Reefer Sanity, to try and sort of use that term, but get us away from this sort of all or nothing thinking when it comes to this drug. Because let's face it, this is a difficult issue to talk about. You know, it's even though it's, you could argue, you know, obviously more addictive drug and more difficult sort of to overcome, a drug like heroin or prescription opiates or cocaine. You know, you're not going to be seeing a lot of people trying to legitimize heroin use, right? I mean, they haven't campaigns to legalize meth lately. And it's a lot easier to talk about those drugs because we see the negative effects of them very, very quickly. You know, someone spiraling down heroin use or meth or cocaine use, whereas marijuana is the kind of drug that, frankly, I call it a slow drug. I mean, it actually takes time often to see what the negative effects are. And in fact, in the beginning, you could rarely see negative effects with most people. And so because of that, and again, because, frankly, my parents' generation remembers being exposed to the film you just saw, a lot of people think this is a benign drug. And so it's difficult to have kind of a rational, science-based discussion on what's really going on. And I think the biggest thing, and you'll hear me repeat this, but my thesis for what I'm going to talk about tonight, I have two main arguments, two main things I want to emphasize. First is that you know, today's marijuana is not the marijuana of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, or even the 1990s. That, you know, even if many of you might have tried marijuana in this room, that the marijuana you tried, except for the group, the 8 boys I see right here in the second row, but the ones that might have tried this 10, 20, 30 years ago, really were trying something or using something that's fundamentally different in composition, potency, strength, and all sorts of things than what it is now. And I'm going to go into more details. And the second thing is that this recent drive to legalize is about one thing. Okay, that one thing is not getting people out of prison. That one thing isn't ending a failed war on drugs. That one thing isn't even about allowing adults to use in the privacy of their own home. Because the majority of the money behind the move to legalize isn't about any of those things, but it's about money. It's about making money as part of a new where people feel like this is just like the end of alcohol prohibition. And since none of us were around then, that, you know, now this is really the chance to make a lot of money and go, you know, laughing all the way to the bank. And I'm going to talk about the evidence I have for both of those statements. But I first thought it would just be interesting to sort of review one quick data point with all of you, which is essentially what we've known in prevention for the last 40 years. And what we've known is that the less risky kids think marijuana is, the more likely they are to use it. That has been true for the last 40-some years. And what we've seen in the last 10 years, especially the last 5 years actually, is a rapid increase in marijuana use nationally, insofar as now 1 in 15 high school seniors are using marijuana daily. So that's about 2 kids in every classroom. Now, the level of smoking cigarettes, by the way, has dramatically among all age groups. And if you think about why that is, why tobacco smoking has fallen and marijuana smoking has increased, I mean, can anybody think of a place where you can legally smoke cigarettes anymore? It's kind of funny to think about it. And maybe your car, but not if you want to resell it, right? So forget that. Not even your home, unless you're partner also smokes and your kids don't mind. But you'll probably be kicked out of your own house these days, right? We've had such a stigma, actually, on smoking. And that's translated into be a public health success, but we now have the opposite of that for marijuana, even though it's technically illegal. You don't have that kind of societal disdain like you do, frankly, for smoking. And what's frightening to me when I look at the rates of kids using, the fact that more 12th graders are smoking marijuana than smoking cigarettes now, is that although we know cigarettes kill you over time, of course, that over time, lungs and the lung cancer that comes with cigarette smoking is seen 30 years usually after you first start. Not always, but usually. With marijuana, we're talking about a drug that is fundamentally different than smoking in that tobacco doesn't get you high. And because tobacco doesn't get you high, you frankly can go to school and your memory, learning, and attention span are not going to be affected, whereas they would be with marijuana. Anybody hear of a tobacco-related car accident lately? With the exception of maybe if you're holding a cigarette in one hand and balancing the steering wheel in another. But, I'm sure that's happened. But other than that, and I say this point because when you compare the two, they're very different in many ways, but actually marijuana comes with the intoxicating parts that tobacco doesn't come with, and yet we have such a societal disdain for tobacco, and I think the recent differences in use are really so care about this in the first place. And I'm going to review tonight most of what's in my book, so those people lucky or unlucky enough to get the book will remember some of this if you've read through it. But the first main myth is that marijuana is non-addictive and harmless. How many people have heard that marijuana is not addictive? Or how many people have heard that it's only psychologically addictive? Right, we've heard that. That's a popular term. Well, let me tell you something. To your brain, addiction is addiction is addiction. There's actually no such thing as psychological addiction, and there's no such thing as physical addiction. Now, there are symptoms of addiction that are either physical or psychological. So you're addicted to heroin, to opiates, you're suffering withdrawal, that can be very physical. Whereas with marijuana, it's more like anxiety and other things that come with that withdrawal, and there is withdrawal with marijuana. But your brain just knows that it wants more. And this is the case with any pleasurable activity. Thank God we have that ability in our brain, otherwise we'd be extinct as a human race, right? Because we wouldn't know that we liked food, and we wouldn't know that we had to procreate. Those are two natural sensations that occur that give us the reward in the brain that tells our brain that we like doing those things, we need to do it again. And again, for us to progress as a human race, that's vital. But when you bring something artificial into that brain, whatever it is, doesn't matter whatever it is, whatever drug it is, it increases that level of happiness, let's just put it that way, in a really an unnatural way, in a way that food or sex or other natural activities don't do. And that's why we love it so much. So heroin, is 20 times more pleasurable than the best kind of food, or more than that even. Well, your brain wants to go back to it. That's what's so deadly, is that your brain is essentially, there was a book 40 years ago called The Selfish Brain. And it is. It's a very selfish brain because it remembers it and it wants to go back to it. Marijuana has that same effect on the brain. In fact, unlike tobacco, as you can see, marijuana affects multiple parts of the brain that are responsible for movement, sensation, executive functioning, vision, coordination, all of these things. And what's interesting is that when we ingest marijuana, the active ingredient, and there are hundreds of components within marijuana. The one thing that gets you high is called THC. And when THC enters your brain or your bloodstream, it binds with these black boxes that you can see, the black dots, which are receptors. We have receptors in our brain, like cannabinoid receptors. This cannabinoid THC binds to that receptor and essentially produces the high. And again, these receptors are in multiple different parts of the brain, by the way, also in the body. Now, what you should realize is that all brains are not created alike in a couple of ways. One, some of us have genetic predispositions to things, and that's where addiction also plays a big role. Mental illness, schizophrenia, these kinds of things are often have some kind of genetic component. Not always, but often do. But also what you should realize is that the adolescent brain is not like the adult brain. And this is only stuff that we've learned in the last 15 or 20 years. We used to think that the brain stopped maturing at about the age of these boys up here, around 14, 15. But actually we know that the brain matures really up until probably age 30, usually between 25 and 30. Now my wife insists that my brain is not yet fully matured, but I keep telling her I'm beyond the age of 30. But anyway, for most people, it's 30. And what's interesting is that your brain, from the, and so what's the executive functioning, the judgment? That matures last. Vision, coordination, and things start first, okay? And we know that marijuana affects all those brains. And so essentially the brain that is not yet 25 is under construction. That's how you can think about it. And when it's under construction, it's vulnerable to all sorts of things, good and bad, right? I mean, when your house is under construction, that's the time when you can decide, like, do you want the marble counters? Do you want the granite counters? There's a lot of things you're deciding, and you get to choose. It's really an exciting time. So in that same way, when your brain is younger than 25, you're figuring out your preferences, what you like, what you're good at. You are learning how to swim do you learn how to swim when you're 5 or when you're 50? Now, you can learn when you're 50, but isn't it a lot harder? Do you learn how to ride a bike when you're 6 or 60? Again, you can learn when you're 60, but it's just going to be. People learn a language when they're very, very young, right? Even a second language. Trust me, I've tried Rosetta Stone. I mean, it works, sort of, but I wish I learned the second language that I'm trying to learn now when I was 4 or 5, because I would be fluent. Well, that's a very important and really cool part about your brain being developing, being under construction. It's figuring out who it is. Now, the flip side of that, the negative of that, is that sort of the other things that could happen to you when your brain is not yet mature also have the ability to stick with you your entire life. So it's not just swimming, soccer, or riding a bike or learning a language. It's things like childhood trauma, right? It's why we care about if kids experience abuse or trauma at that age, that can stick with them their entire life. That's frankly more damning than if that trauma would happen later. And another example is drugs, and any drug. And obviously alcohol is included in drug. It's a drug of abuse. The only difference is it happens to be legal. Only difference. And so these drugs that enter the adolescent brain have a special ability to essentially hijack the brain and teach the brain that it likes these things at the time that the brain is figuring out what it likes, if that makes sense. And so that's why we care a lot about young people using substances or really engaging in any harmful activity, because that is when the brain is fit. And if the brain, and you get used to doing that at a young age, it's much harder to stop later. Tobacco is the most addictive drug known to man. That's not an argument to legalize heroin, though. Right? Just because tobacco is more addictive than heroin, but heroin's illegal, we wouldn't say, well, let's treat heroin like tobacco. That doesn't make any sense. So this isn't for policy. It's more just to see how, the things that our brain gets used to faster, essentially. But what's interesting is the text on top, which is that even though only 9% of adults who try marijuana will become addicted, so that's 1 in 10 adults who try it for the first time, that number skyrockets to 1 in 6 if you're 16 years old. If you're 14 years old, that number is 1 in 4. So it means that 1 in 4 14-year-olds who try marijuana will at some point become addicted. Now, the Psychiatric Association just determined in its manual that marijuana withdrawal is an actual diagnosis, and there's been studies that have been showing that people actually withdraw also from a drug like marijuana. It's not just opiates and heroin that produce withdrawal. But again, I said 1 in 4 14-year-olds, right? That means 3 out of 4 won't. So I'm not here to say that everybody who tries any drug is going to be addicted. But the issue is you're essentially rolling the dice. You're playing Russian roulette. And it may be you, it may not be you. You don't know. That's the thing. You have no idea. None of us do. But I don't think that this message really has gone out to the American people as much as it should. Anybody in the audience here been hanging out at the annual meeting of the American Medical Association lately? No? Really? Come on. How about annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, Society of Addiction Medicine? Do you think the average American is hanging out at the annual meeting of the American Medical Association? No. And so this is not known. And instead, what is known is what you Google. Do you think we use Google to find out the effects of marijuana when an average 14-year-old wants to find out? Or do you think they use Medline? Do you even know what Medline is? Some of the scientists in here do. Medline is when you look up peer-reviewed journals that are scientifically valid. That's the Google of that. It's called Medline. I have a feeling they're using Google. And so when you use Google and you turn on the television and you're living in Colorado and you're walking by a store and you're opening up a magazine and you're turning on the TV in Oregon and we're bombarded by all sorts of things that are telling us that, yeah, most people are fine. So of course you will be. By the way, do you think any alcoholic or drug addict starts out saying, I'm going to be the one that's not fine? No. And so, in fact, we know that denial, even at late stages of addiction, is the hallmark of all drug dependence, is denial. I mean, everyone is almost always in denial, including families. And so that's what makes it a very difficult disease, really, to overcome addiction, because people are denying that they have a problem all the time, or they're saying what we always hear, I can stop at any time, right? Doesn't that sound familiar? So my thing is that I'm not saying that this is the devil weed and reefer madness and you're all going to go to hell if you try marijuana. What I'm saying is you're playing Russian roulette, and essentially most people don't know this. And the gap, in my estimation, has never been greater between the American public's misunderstanding of marijuana and the scientific understanding of it. Because every week showing negative effects, but that is not known at all. Now, what is up? Why is there such a difference between the marijuana some parents in this room might have tried in the 60s and 70s or 80s and the marijuana that kids try today? Well, the big difference, as I said earlier, is the potency of the drug. The potency has gone from an average of 1 to 3% products that are out there that are above 50%, 80%, even above 90%, these concentrates that are vaporized. And a lot of kids today, if you think cigarettes are sort of going down in terms of fashion, well, you don't know a lot about e-cigarettes then, which essentially, actually Oxford University just named the word of the year. Do you know what the word of the year today was named? Do you know what it was? Who knew that? Oh, okay, I was wondering if it was one of the kids or that was you. Okay, came over there. That's right, vape. Okay, that's a word of the year from actually my alma mater. So, that has become vaporizing, essentially using electronic. It's actually nothing to do with a cigarette. It's a contraption that looks like a cigarette, and it's using the liquid of. It's safer than smoking regular cigarettes, yeah, but it's certainly not safe. And when it comes to marijuana, you're oftentimes actually ingesting all sorts of harmful things along with it. It's different than e-tobacco cigarettes. The point is, the potency has skyrocketed. This isn't your Woodstock weed that's out there. And, a lot of people in this community, a lot of people are concerned about genetic modification, GMOs, food. And I had someone recently say the other day, I'm a vegan, I don't touch anything that's not locally sourced, but I love marijuana. And I said, oh, okay, well, I have some news to break to you, and I don't know how you're going to take this, which is essentially I had to tell her, you cannot have imagined a more GMO product than today's marijuana. Okay? The amount of genetic modification that has gotten into the agriculture space on marijuana, because that is how he has been manipulated. And I hear this all the time. Cannabis has been smoked for thousands of years, Kevin, by the Chinese or the Egyptians and whatnot. Yes, that's true, along by some of those populations. But not only is the marijuana different 60 years ago, you can imagine how different it was 3,000 years ago. The natural cannabis plant has nowhere near the levels of THC that are out there. But of course, our agricultural techniques have advanced dramatically since that time, especially in the last 20 years, that we have figured out a way to genetically modify marijuana. In the 60s, if you wanted good pot, you wanted Mexican pot. Sinsemilla, it was called. Sinsemilla means without seeds, right? You wanted pure stuff. Now, it's definitely made in America or Canada marijuana that you want, not Mexican marijuana. That's what you call ditchweed. Whereas today, marijuana made in the USA, I guess, is frankly much better in terms of the potency. It's because we've learned how to manipulate the THC. I don't know if any of you have seen this before, the thing that's at the end of the needle there in brown. I don't know if any of you have seen this before, but this is another example of, frankly, something beyond the wildest dreams of Cheech and Chong and anyone else you can imagine, okay? They could not have imagined this in their wildest dreams. This is 90% plus concentrated marijuana extract, which essentially looks like a wax that is at the end of a needle. And I don't know about you, but that at the end of a needle, to me, looks like a very different drug than marijuana. It certainly doesn't look like something you would ever smoke. And I don't often quote High Times magazine. You could probably imagine why. But this quote on the money, essentially it says, with dabs, because it's called dabbing, that's what this act of this is called, and that's often called a dab. Your local Action News team gets to do a marijuana story that shows crack pipe torches used on sticky heroin-looking goo made from a process that blows up like meth labs. Doesn't sound like what Cheech and Chong are doing or what you would, be holding at a roach clip. Anyone even know what a roach clip is? I know these kids definitely don't know what it is, but these old terms. This is something brand new. In fact, actually, I was at a school presenting in front of high schoolers, and they said, the vice principal was introducing me, and somebody raised their hand and said, is Dr. Sabet going to talk, the vice principal said, I should start the story over. The vice principal said, Dr. Sabet is going to be talking about that roach clip that gets passed around at your parties. And this poor high school class, it was like 1,000 kids. They looked at her like she was speaking Japanese. They had no idea. This was in central Iowa. They had no idea what she was talking about. And somebody raised his hand and said, I have no idea what a roach clip is, but is he going to be talking about dabbing? And she says, the vice principal says back to the poor kid, no, he's not talking about dabbing. He's talking about marijuana. What are you talking about? And I think when she said roach clip, they actually thought I was going to talk about a new form of insect extermination or something. Because this kids had no idea what I was talking about. But again, it represents that gap that I think a lot of today's parents and adults have with this whole issue. Because they've seen many of their friends successfully go on to be whomever and whatever, very successfully, or use marijuana in adulthood or rediscover it in adulthood or whatnot, and they don't think it's a big deal. And they don't realize that, first of all, we know a lot more about the brain than we did in 1969. And secondly, that the marijuana is very, very different. And this is just an example of how that is different. Now, when we look over time at the way heavy marijuana use affects people, we do see worse life outcomes. Now, I'm not talking about the occasional user. So let me just be very clear. I'm not trying to say that the 60-year-old guy who smokes a joint after work once a year or once a month is my target of the conversation. My target of my conversation tonight is the heavy or more than occasional user that starts in adolescence. And by the way, the vast majority of people who have problems with drugs or alcohol, they started when they were young. Anybody in here know a drug addict or alcoholic who abstained from their drug of choice until age 21? No, I didn't think so. Now, you sometimes have the exception with some of the opiate, the pills and stuff like that. But no, not one hand in here. This is a pediatric onset disease. This starts when you're young. Because what we're seeing when studies that look at people over 20-year spans, when you put all the probabilities together and you control for the things that would be otherwise explaining what happened, you control for those things, we're finding lower median income. We're finding lower chances of a university degree. We're finding lower IQ and intelligence. And I think those things are very important. As we compete, and as I look at these kids here are going to be competing on the global marketplace in 10 years, and I travel around the world and I read headlines in China and India that are about programs sending people to the moon and the scientific discoveries and the technology booms and the manufacturing booms. And then I come back to the U.S. and I read Colorado opened its 700th marijuana store. I think we need to be thinking about where that places, frankly, our stature in the world. And I know we're in a city here that is home to a well-known company that employs a lot of people. I think that's going to have long-term implications if we go down this path of marijuana. Good luck to the class of 2018, 17, who is going to be competing with people when right now America is something like 32 out of 37 in terms of our science rank for kids for the industrialized countries. We're something like 31 for math and 28 for reading. Folks, the South Koreans read English better than our average students. That's a real problem. Now, that's a problem for a lot of reasons. I'm not blaming drugs. It's a problem for a lot of reasons. But the idea that we would want to add anything to essentially risk our kids' future and really our country's future, a drug that demotivates you, a drug that we have seen over time has effects on intelligence and comprehension, is something I really can't understand why we would want to do that. It's as if I think that's very cocky of us as Americans, actually, to think that we can get away with that in another generation. And I think it has huge implications. Right now, by the way, I hate to bring doomsday here, but I'll keep on that theme for a second if you indulge me. Right now, the graduating class of last year for college, worst time ever to look for a job since the Great Depression. So second worst time in our history. Worst time ever in our history in terms of probability of having a successful family. Worst time ever. And also the worst time ever, the lowest chances, the class of 2014, the lowest chances of doing better than your parents' generation, ever. And I see where we're going. I just don't see why we think we can gamble any more than, frankly, we already do. And by the way, who's going to be also hit? Not just students. When kids start doing more poorly on exams and things like that in Colorado and other teachers, right? It's the teachers that get blamed for the lower exam scores. I think that's something we need to think about as well. The other issue that is the elephant in the room of all of this is mental health. We have unfortunately had to live through some tragedies, and we continue to live through them, it seems, because we cannot address the issue of adolescent mental health, it seems like. 50 years ago for mental health, said, well, we're just going to put them in, hope they get better and kind of just put them in a big mansion down the country road and, in an insane asylum and just kind of hope for the best. Then 30 years ago, we said, it seems a little inhumane and it's too expensive. Let's deinstitutionalize, get them all out, and, we'll have them go to the shrink once a week, and we might cover that on insurance, we might not, and, we'll make sure we get a lot of pills, give them a lot of pills to stabilize them. And about 5 years ago, we've shifted again. I actually hope for the better now, where we're actually trying to treat mental health like physical health. In fact, you're going to be so proud of your elected officials when I tell you how progressive they were. It only took them 53 years from the time it was introduced, 53 years ago, to acknowledge something that is just so progressive and fascinating. You're going to be so proud, which is that the brain is part of the body. Isn't that amazing? Someone's working in D.C. Now, when I say that, I mean that they finally, 3 or 4 years ago, came to the acknowledgement that a hip replacement was as important as treating a disease of the mind. That tennis elbow was as important as treating something that was going wrong up here. Because we have always segregated those two things. We've said, oh, you need a hip replacement, or your elbow is hurting, or you sprained your ankle at sports, or you fell, or no problem, we'll take care of you over here. Oh, you're having PTSD or schizophrenic symptoms, a psychotic episode. Here's some pills, and we'll hope for the best, and don't try and get your insurance to cover it because we only cover 18%. We're now finally trying to treat those two things the same. But we're still sort of stumbling in our way to do that. That's a very new idea. When we've known for 30 years, there was the pioneering study from Sweden that looked at 45,000 Swedish conscripts that essentially found that the more marijuana that was used, the more probability of schizophrenia. Then we have the studies from 20 years ago, so after that wave, essentially showing that if you used marijuana before 15, you had a 4.5 times more likelihood to have a psychotic episode versus if you used it later in life. And then now we have the studies from about a year ago, it's not on this, but from about a year ago, that folks, we actually know the genotype if you are predisposed to schizophrenia. We actually have a name for that genotype. We've mapped it out, which is amazing, in the human genome, your DNA, we know. And what scientists have done is they've taken that, and people with that, and they've tested this, and they've essentially found that if you have that genetic predisposition, which a certain percentage of us do, that it's something like 7 times more likely that you're going to have schizophrenia if you smoke marijuana regularly as a youngster, controlling for everything else. So we're learning about all of these effects. And by the way, I'm not going to talk about the recent, shootings or anything like that. You can all do the investigating for yourself. There are a lot of reasons for those things and those tragedies. Of course there are. But you should look and see what one of the common threads were. You might be surprised. It's not something that's often reported in the media. The big thing that I referred to earlier was this issue of intelligence, and actually we now have the definitive study on this. Now there needs to be more, but this was something that was shocking to the scientific world. Essentially what these researchers in New Zealand found after following over 1,000 people for 20 years of their life, okay, they would check in with the same people for 20 years. They essentially found that those people regularly as youngsters, 3 to 4 times a week for 3 to 4 years, were significantly more likely to lose 6 to 8 points on the IQ scale. Now, what does that mean? You might be thinking, what's 6 to 8 points? I mean, who cares, or what is it? What does that mean? Well, essentially, if you are, now I know that there's a lot of parents here and there's some kids, but I know that most of you, I'm sure, and you'll confirm this with me, I'm sure, most of your kids are all geniuses, right? 150 on the IQ scale. So we're not talking about your kids, other kids. I'm not talking about any of you. You're all 150 too. And if you're 150 and you lose 6 or 8 points, what's the big deal? 142 is still pretty good, right? That's like in the 99th percentile still. And people say, well, Steve Jobs used the marijuana, and he created Apple computers, and all these smart people, Carl Sagan, I mean, amazing people. And that's true. They did, and they didn't see much IQ loss, or if they did, we really didn't miss it, right? Because they're still geniuses in their own right. But I have news for some of the students in here and also some of the adults in here. Not every child can be a genius. I know that's sad to hear, but there is an average, and there's a reason why we have the word average. The average IQ in an average school classroom is 100, not 150. So if you're average and you lose 8 points from 100, folks, that is the difference between getting the degree you want versus the degree you're settling for. That's the difference between getting the job you want or the promotion you want versus the one that you don't get. So if you're Steve Jobs with 150 and you're a genius coasting along, maybe you can take the chance. But if you're an average kid, that has some major implications. And again, I think it has major implications for our global competitiveness in the future. And I didn't even begin to talk about work for today's employers with marijuana and these different laws and the lawsuits that are starting and all these. That's a whole other thing, which if you have questions, I think we have note cards that have been passed out. Feel free to ask that or any other question. But I am very, very concerned about this issue of IQ. Now, as I said earlier, I think the gulf has never been greater between science and the public's misunderstanding. I'm going to skip through the medical marijuana bit as well, because I know we're running short on time and I still want to show a short 9-minute film. But essentially, I get asked this all the time, is marijuana medicine? And the answer is really no, yes, and maybe. Just like if somebody asked me, how's that for a politician answer? No, but it's just like if somebody asked me, is opium medicine? Well, anybody smoke opium lately instead of choosing morphine? No. We don't smoke opium to get the effects of morphine. But morphine comes from opium. Same is true for marijuana. It does have medicinal properties, most likely. You don't need to smoke marijuana to get those properties. And I think there's convincing evidence that marijuana can, but it's not the marijuana you're thinking about. It's not smoking a joint. That's very, very different. And really, the exciting part of this is the maybe column, which is that research is ongoing. Now, how many of you in here have taken an aspirin in the last year? Okay. Keep your hand up if you took aspirin in its natural form. That would be willow bark. Anybody chew willow bark lately? No? Come on. It's supposed to be a natural path kind of audience, I thought. It's the same thing, folks. If you grew a willow tree in your backyard and you took the bark from it and you put it in your mouth and chewed it, the acid that your saliva with the willow bark create, that is aspirin. Do you know that? That's where aspirin comes from. But we don't choose to do that because we've sort of moved on from the Middle Ages, right? I mean, we want something that has, if you were going to Florida, not that anybody does here in the winter, but if you do go to Florida, can you imagine if you went to the pharmacist for aspirin and you had to ask him, what time of year was this grown, this aspirin? Are there any molds or pesticides? Was it indoor or outdoor? What was the weather like where this was grown? Well, you don't have to because we've standardized medicine. That's good. The aspirin you get here is the same that you get from Florida. That's really good to know. It gives you some assurances. Marijuana, that's one of the reasons why we don't need to smoke marijuana to get its natural beneficial effects. There are other ways. In fact, there are medications coming through the pipeline now that are non-smoked and essentially offer a lot of the relief. And I'm not going to go into the details of those, but we know, by the way, there are other components in marijuana that have medicinal properties, not just THC. One is called CBD. Remember from the slide showing the THC going up and the other? CBD was basically zero. There's no CBD in most smoked marijuana today, or very little amounts. Why? CBD doesn't get you high. And so, but there are medicinal value of CBD, and that's what researchers are looking at. So if you have questions about that, I'll talk about it. Didn't want to dwell on it. Folks, my big concern about marijuana, again, is not the ex-hippie smoking a joint once in a while. My big concern is the fact that we are creating in front of our eyes the next tobacco industry of our time. That's my concern. Now, I don't think people should go to jail for using small amounts if they're an adult, if you're not driving, etc. That's a different story. One thing to say that, and it's a very different thing to essentially allow the retail sales of another addictive drug on top of the already addictive drugs that we allow. So my concern isn't so much, the Grateful Dead and, the kind of Cheech and Chong folks. My concern is, frankly, guys that look like this. The Yale MBAs that are raking in and fundraising tens of millions of dollars for a future marijuana industry. By the way, some people think the guy on the right sort of looks like me. I'm kind of offended by that. But anyway, my point is, folks, these are the Yale MBAs, and I mean that, literally the Yale MBAs, who have the billion-dollar business plans to become the Philip Morris of pot, in their own terms, in their own words. And I think that is very scary. We had 100 years of lies and deceit from the tobacco industry, lest we forget. And the idea that we would just forget about that and be okay to me, very frightens. I'm going to show a very short film on that subject and then come right back to you, and then we'll take questions. We put this ad in the New York Times. It was the first non-government funded ad, full color, anti-drug ad in the Times. And just to get our point across, that that the perception is sort of this hippie kind of movement. The reality is the corporate CEO. And today, another announcement, not just the word vape, another big marijuana announcement today, this morning, which is that the Bob Marley family is now teaming up with these guys, literally these guys, to promote this new brand of cigarettes, which they say are not aimed at kids and are really just there to as a lifestyle brand as opposed to a brand out there to make money. But you're not in the addictive industry, folks, if you're not in it to make money. And you're also not in the addictive industry if you don't rely on, frankly, those that are addicted to your substance in order to make money. Well, for those of you that like to enjoy a glass of wine with dinner every night, and you're part of the 85% of Americans that drink responsibly, I have news for you. You're very unimportant people in the eyes of the alcohol industry. Very unimportant. Now, if you're a heavy drinker, if you've destroyed or are nearly destroying your life, if it's getting in the way of your family and your work, if you're having much more than a glass of wine with dinner or some beers when you watch the game on the weekend, you are part of the 15% of Americans that are unhealthy users of alcohol. You consume 80% of the volume of alcohol in this country. Let me say that again. Let's say about 20% of people consume 80% of the volume of alcohol. Whereas 20% of you, whereas 80% of you consume only 20%. And those industries rely on that minority of users, the 20% users. And by the way, gambling is very similar. You know, who gets upgraded to the penthouse suite in Las Vegas when they go, you know, to check in at the hotel there? Is it the person that plays blackjack once a year, $100 on his birthday? No. It's the high roller that bets his life savings on the craps table every other week, or every other day, right? That's because you have to enrich and support your best customers, because those are the ones that are lining your pockets. So folks, this cannot be about just a responsible adult wanting to use once in a while. What's the big deal without being called a criminal? It's not about that. It's about hooking young people, starting young, getting those lifelong customers, keeping them. I'm going to end with just a few slides on Colorado and Washington. $1 joint if you show your ski pass. Now, I don't know about you. I'm already not a great skier. The last thing I want to do is be on the slopes in Colorado with somebody. No, but in all seriousness, this is what it's come down to. It's the widespread promotion and commercialization. These sodas, we were told, originally were for the dying 85-year-old cancer patient who needed medical marijuana. Can you please find me an 85-year-old person that wants a grape marijuana soda with a skeleton on the front that would make anybody high with one sip? I don't think so. Yeah, maybe they want the ice cream bar instead. And let me tell you, I say that, but, some people say, well, how did we get here? Well, folks, the image of the marijuana user changed 20 years ago. It changed from the lazy stoner type to the 80-year-old with cancer. That was how it was presented. This is medical. It's all medical. Now, a few years once most bought into that, now they're saying, well, actually, it's really for everybody. And the true colors are actually coming out. These are the Vaporizing, the third largest tobacco company in the world, just bought a big Silicon Valley startup called for their Plume product that allows you to vaporize both tobacco vapor from nicotine and marijuana. Good luck if you're the 8th grade principal thinking that you can detect marijuana use in the boys' room anymore. This is odorless. It looks like a pen highlighter. It plugs into the side of the computer. It looks like a flash drive. That's how you charge it. And it's not just this. There are hundreds of products like this. Here, I went into a store in Colorado, folks. By the way, does this look like something that an adult would want? I mean, this is like a candy store at your local mall. But anyway, when I walked into this particular store, they looked at me and they said, "Are you medical or recreational?" And I said, "I don't know, you tell me. What do I look like to you?" And they said, "Well, it depends how much time you have." I said, "Please explain." They said, "Well, if you have about half an hour, we'll call the doctor on call, who's waiting, and they'll be here in 6 minutes. It'll take you 2 minutes to fill out the form, which tells the doctor what ailment you have. And don't worry, there's headaches, insomnia, stress, anxiety." I said, "Can I check all of the above? I mean, I really qualify for medical marijuana. I mean, stress, anxiety, headaches, insomnia." And then they said, "Okay, and so you can do that, and then you'll be able to buy your marijuana at a cheaper than recreational, because recreational is taxed." The average citizen in Colorado doesn't want to smoke marijuana any more than most of you probably don't, I hope. But the average voter, like counting on many of you, voted for it because they thought, what? They thought it would be a budget of the government, right? School, construction, parks, beautiful, I mean, baseball fields, apple pie. I mean, everything against school construction, right? So that's the to try and play good on those problems. They're not making the money that they thought they would, but they have to tax it very high. So there's untaxed medical and a taxed recreational. Anyway, I said, I don't really have a lot of time for this, so I can't wait for your doctor because I got to go. I had to go in about 10 minutes. So I'll just do recreational, and I want to buy some candy bars because I wanted to show it. Cash only. I said, okay. I had $60 cash, but I thought I could buy, what do you think, like 5 or 6 candy bars? At least. That'd be like $10 a bar. It's expensive. I thought at least. I could barely afford 2. Because I also had to buy, they said, do you have the child-proof bag? And I said, no, I don't walk around with one. But tell me what. And it was essentially a white Ziploc. That was the child-proof bag with like a little fastener that anybody could get into. That was $4.75. And then, for one. And then the 2 candy bars that were this big and the tiny chocolate mint, it came to about $63 with the tax and everything like that. By the way, what does that tell you? Where is the best place to be a drug dealer now? Right? Yeah, exactly. On the streets of Colorado. Why? Because the demand is soaring. You can undercut the legal price, exactly, make it cheaper. And that's why the black market's actually thriving right now there. Some of the coupons that we found. There's a lot of data showing that states with legally protected dispensaries, stores for medical stores, have higher rates of abuse, and actually that's where kids get the 3rd biggest source of medical marijuana for kids is somebody else's medical marijuana recommendation. What happened to the cancer patient, the AIDS patient? I thought this was about people with MS. Now, I'm sure there is a percentage, there's about 2% of every state of people with medical have MS, AIDS, cancer, ALS, or any kind of debilitating disease. Frankly, for that 2%, folks, I don't care if they're smoking marijuana. I don't care if they want to use heroin, for that matter. They're in a state that I'm not in. I'm not going to judge them for any of that, and I don't think anybody would. We'd all want whatever makes them feel better. But that's not what, in most states, this is about. That's the problem. It's written in a way that's so open, and that's why we have rates of abuse of marijuana twice as high in medical states than non-medical. That's why car crashes in Colorado have risen dramatically since they started commercializing marijuana in 2009. Folks, driving while you're stoned doubles your risk of a car crash. And when kids are surveyed this, 90% of them thinks it doesn't do anything, or it makes them a better driver. And I have to tell people, I'm sorry, Johnny, just because you think you're a better driver if you're going 35 and a 70, that's about as dangerous as going 90 and a 70. They're both dangerous. And most of the time, marijuana is used with alcohol. And so that actually is even worse than drinking alone, and it's worse than pot alone when you use them together and drive. And there's been this thing about the substitution effect, which really isn't happening. And then the other thing that some parents, and many of you might have, I hope didn't think, but many of you know people that think this, they say, well, I'm going to introduce marijuana to my kid because at least it's marijuana, first of all, they say. I'd rather them do it with me, the dad. I'd rather, Johnny do it with his dad than, go out there with a stranger. So I'm going to do it in control, whether it's alcohol or pot. I'm going to do it in a controlled condition. We're going to host a party or so they can do it under our roof. And again, it's kind of like the girl who was the vegan that I had to tell her that it was GMO marijuana. I have to sometimes tell the poor dad, you know what, sir, if you think that your 16-year-old only wants to smoke pot with his dad and doesn't do it anywhere else unless you're introducing it to him, I'm sorry, I have news to break for you. But again, these are a lot of the misconceptions because parents reason the same way they do. They don't. Now, it doesn't mean that young people aren't smart. They often know what you're thinking before you have thought it. But the reasoning is different. There's a scientific reason for that, right? Again, it all comes back to the brain. You know what else comes back to the brain? These gummy bears and advertising of these cartoons and all these kinds of things. That is focused on young people. Anybody here over 30 been waking up on Saturday morning and watching cartoons lately? Can you imagine if the agenda before you today, rather than in Times 12 font, was written in a large crayon in a Times 60 font? If it was, it would be aiming at young people. I'm exaggerating about that to make a point, but the point is that this does all come back down to brain development. And so when I have to hear in Colorado that this industry wants the gummy bears, and I ask the industry people, well, you say this is for adults of your own home. Why do you need, Sour Patch gummies laced with marijuana? And they say, well, that's not aimed towards kids. No, that's just, it's what a lot of adults like. I mean, again, and I do like Sour Patch Kids sometimes when I watch and I go to the movies. We all do, some of us do, but give me a break. This is clearly aimed. And then when you had the 19-year-old who died because he went to Colorado, had a candy bar, marijuana candy bar, because he wanted to try it, and ended up having a psychotic episode, according to 4 of his friends who were witnesses, and fell off a balcony. The response from the industry is twofold. The response is first, well, he didn't die from the marijuana, he died from falling. Who knows why he fell? Again, that's like when the tobacco industry said, we don't know why these smokers are getting lung cancer. It could be for all sorts of reasons. They're not dying from smoking, they're dying from lung cancer, Kevin. Well, they would have gotten lung cancer if they weren't smoking, first of all. And then the second thing is when you say, well, why do you have to sell these? They say, oh, Kevin, you didn't look at the candy bar. It's 16 servings in a candy bar. So he should have divided it into 16 pieces. And I said, I don't know about the rest of you. There's a candy bar in front of me. I'm not dividing it into 16 pieces. Right? Or when we're being told, well, Kevin, the gummy bear, the serving size is 1 arm. Like the gummy bear that's like this, the arm. I mean, it's ridiculous, but these are the things. This is what happens when you entrust this to an industry, which is exactly what's happened in Colorado. So I want to take questions because I know we're running out of time. I'm going to move forward. On my last slide, are we collecting the questions?
Yeah, just if anybody
Sure.
has any questions, we'll do it 2 ways. You can submit a card, we have people collecting them, or we'll let you ask it directly.
So while we're collecting those, people ask, well, what happened a couple of the marijuana votes in Oregon and Alaska? $9 million spent on the pro side. The anti side had $400,000. There's not a lot of money when you're a teacher or a social worker opposing this. There is a lot of money when you're in industry and you're ready to make a ton of cash in Oregon and Alaska. And that is exactly what we've seen. So while we're collecting, the last thing is we started a group to counter this whole movement because I don't want to leave this such a hopeless feeling. I think that this can be overcome. I think that people are going to see the perils of Colorado and they're going to say, we don't want Michigan to look like Colorado. We don't want other states to look like Colorado and Washington. And so a bipartisan group we started called Project SAM. And I can give you more information about it if you'd like. But our website has all of this information if you want stats at your fingertips. It's learnaboutsam.org. My email is there. Feel free to send me an email. More people in Michigan involved, actually, because we need the local voices. Your city council needs to hear from you. Unfortunately, they hear from, marijuana supporters, who are writing emails and stuff to them, at a very large rate. We need to counter a lot of that. So this is the website. It'll tell you how to get involved. All the stats are there. And let's take some questions.
Okay, we'll start with the cards, and if anybody has
Sure.
any questions, we'll add it in there. How can we effectively counter the economic driving forces trying to legalize marijuana, and what are effective strategies for doing so?
Well, essentially, again, I know it's overwhelming, right? The economic part of this is money, this is how can we as citizens overcome this? But I really think that we can. I think that we start collecting the stories and the data from Colorado and other states, which we're doing, and we disseminate that as much as possible to our neighbors, our elected officials. You're going to be sitting around with friends and family over the holidays, Thanksgiving, etc. Issue may come up. This issue is something that comes up at these kinds of things. People like to talk about, well, what do you think about this or that? If you're armed with the facts, the fact that, for example, for every dollar in alcohol, we spend 10 in social would be and you're And that's why you have it. That's what we were told. Folks, it's the same thing over and over again. Those kinds of arguments, the evidence base, and really join us in our effort.
Okay, most of the studies were based out of New Zealand, Australia, and Sweden. Do we have studies in the information for America? Just curious, not saying the studies are.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So actually, it's kind of the work that I presented tonight, it's funny, I didn't think about that, but it happened to be from those 3 countries who do a lot of research. Actually, the U.S. does 85% of the world's research on drug abuse. So we have multiple studies from the United States on this. And in my book, you'll find it. It's just that tonight, in the course of the conversation, I happen to highlight those, but they're not representative, really, of the studies. So.
How is marijuana regulated for safety and geographies where it is approved for medical or consumer use? What's the role or authority of the FDA and USDA?
So the federal authorities have zero role because it's illegal on the federal level. And again, we've bypassed the FDA because for some reason we think that we can vote on what medicine is. Can you believe that? Can you imagine if you voted on the next medicine for, I don't know, hypertension? Anybody here do? I mean, maybe some of you are in the lab and are qualified to do that. I'm not. I don't know if any, but that's what we've done with marijuana. We've basically said, we're going to make this exception for one substance where we're going to vote on it and just kind of see what the voters want, and then we're going to call that medicine. It's incredible. But again, it's because it's been about the compassion argument. So have no control. In the state, they're trying to have control, but it's very difficult to do so. Colorado yesterday, they just ended in deadlock, and they have no regulations now for the edibles because you have the industry on the one hand and public health workers who are frankly outgunned on the other hand, trying to work out a compromise to regulate, label. You know, a lot of people say, Kevin, it doesn't have to be this way. They say, Kevin, I don't like big marijuana any more than you, but why don't we just have the government, at least we can regulate it and actually try and make some money and not have, but the point is that doesn't happen when you have this industry involvement. So that's what we've been seeing in Colorado.
I'll give you a breather to say the videos and everything, the presentations you've seen tonight will be on our website, hopefully tomorrow, so you can access those again. I know Kevin went through somewhat fast, so you can go back and look at those. I'm going to edit this question a little bit because I think the answer to the question maybe tells our kids a little too much, so pardon me.
Okay.
The question is about cigarettes, and if somebody uses marijuana in an e-cigarette, you can't smell it when it's something other than marijuana. Can you smell it if it's marijuana? No,
not usually. No, but you could detect it in drug testing, so obviously. And the thing about marijuana versus alcohol in drug testing is alcohol is really liquid, water soluble, right? It goes through your system very fast. Marijuana stays in your system longer. Most people about 5 days, for some people 30. I mean, everyone thinks that marijuana stays in your system for 30 days. That's not true. For most people, it'll be out in 5 to 7 days, but it does absorb in your fat. And so that's why it does stay around longer. And of course, it would be there if you vaporized it as well, whether you smoked it or vaporized it.
This is an interesting one. Do you suspect that other countries might help with our demise?
Do I suspect that they are or they will? Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think so. But I mean, what's interesting about other, we just need to follow Europe because they're so more enlightened. And we're going to. No European country has gotten close to what we're doing in our states here in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. We are way ahead or behind, depending on how you want to put it, in terms of the marijuana policy. So the Netherlands has a modified version. It's very small. Portugal, you cannot buy it on a legal market in Portugal, even though they have sort of decriminalized, but they haven't legalized. Uruguay is the only other country that's going this way, but they have a very tightly controlled, it's a state-regulated system through pharmacies. It's very different than the Colorado style, as we call it, legalization, which we have in America. So we are kind of the testing ground, the guinea pig now, as the rest of the world watches. And what's interesting is that this is an area where we are in total violation of our international UN obligations. Control international treaties with almost every country in the world about drugs. We've actually been the leader on pushing countries to do the same thing, and now on the state level, we're in violation. So there's a little irony there.
Is there data to support growth is inhibited with early use in adolescence?
What kind of growth? Brain growth or? Yeah, I mean, just growth, like just in general. Well, there's data to talk about certainly the brain and how brain, growth, and about, how the white matter in the brain and the connectors, the parts that connect the neurons in our brain, are greatly affected by marijuana, especially at a young age. In terms of like physical growth, not that I know of, but definitely reproductive system. There are, especially in men and boys, actually, the connection with lower sperm count and things like that, because marijuana does affect the parts of the brain that regulate your reproductive system. We've been seeing that more and more.
I think I'll take this one. It was voted on in Saginaw, Michigan. What happened? Well, it was decriminalized in Saginaw and in Mount Pleasant, home of CMU. Concerned about that at all? And also, I don't know exactly what happened in Clare County, but I think it was turned down, voted down in Clare County. Okay, so those are the three that I know of in our.
But it wasn't legalized in Saginaw. That's the difference.
Correct.
Yeah, so it was criminal penalties. But again, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how many people in Saginaw are spending the year in prison for smoking marijuana. Zero. Right, exactly. But that's a problem. There's this perception that we have this war on drugs that's locking all these poor people up who are just wanting to smoke a joint now and then. And the reality is that's not the case, but these votes were essentially redundant, I think, because no focus on that level of user anyway, but so they're really more symbolic in nature.
Okay. Couldn't laws be put in place to prevent? Could we use the areas where it's been legalized?
Yeah, well, we've tried to do that with alcohol, and it's very difficult. Commercial speech is free speech, according to the Supreme Court. So the idea of telling a company, you can't say this, you can't do that, is very, very difficult. Why don't we have tobacco advertisements now? Well, that was a voluntary, essentially, thing, because after 100 years of lies, the government basically said, we're about to outlaw you unless you, A, turn over all your papers, and B, stop advertising and focusing on kids. And so the tobacco companies, who, by the way, are making more money than ever now still, basically said, okay, fine, we'll do those things. It's voluntary. Alcohol had a voluntary ban for advertising too. That lasted about 3 years. That's why you see Absolute Vodka being advertised on TV and in magazines now, because those bans were voluntary and they've been reversed. So it's actually, once you let that cat, it's very difficult, in my estimation, to be able to stop the widespread promotion and commercialization.
Okay, if marijuana complications increase, if it starts with the youth, then what about babies being born addicted to marijuana? We really don't hear much about that.
Yeah, we don't, but there's a huge literature on pregnant, postpartum women and marijuana, and in terms of affecting actually brain mass, affecting all sorts of development things, as we should expect, given the effects on young people. That's a growing area of research. Another area of research I didn't mention, which I should, is secondhand smoke. Yesterday, a study came out, one of the most definitive that's been out there, basically finding that marijuana secondhand smoke affects your heart and your blood vessels in the same way as cigarettes secondhand smoke. That had not been found before, and we're finding that with this higher strength THC marijuana. That was, I'm trying to, if you Google it, you'll find, it was out of Association. In fact, it's on heart.org, which is the American. They have a press release about it, and it was, I believe, researchers from UC San Francisco. But I would Google it. It was all over the news 2 days ago.
Okay, and the last question I have here, and then I'll turn it to the crowd, is can you please explain DAB better?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So essentially what a DAB is and what dabbing is and the picture is, essentially it is using butane, which I didn't mention. Normally butane, by the way, not always. And with that butane, extracting through a kind of a toxic, difficult process with fire and all sorts of things, and gas, extracting the THC from the marijuana plant, which basically turns into a wax. And sometimes it's called oil, honey oil, but it's usually butane hash oil, BHO is another name. And you run the risk of blowing up whatever building you're in or room you're in when you do that. In fact, they've had multiple explosions in Seattle and Denver. We're trying to do this at home and trying to extract concentrates. But they're fully legal in Colorado, Washington, and in Alaska and Oregon. It will soon be fully legal to buy a concentrate from a store, and these are places that, again, there's no real oversight about where this is done or what's being done, but it's a very toxic process.
Okay, I'll open it up to a couple questions here. This seems to be a public health issue.
Yeah.
Yet we don't hear the authorities voicing their concerns. So you talk also about money. So my concern is if money is buying out their voices.
Well, I don't know. You know, the American Medical Association, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, the American Cancer Society, the American Glaucoma Association, all of these groups, American Psychiatric Association, Psychological Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, those are the ones I remember off the top of my head. They've all come out with statements basically saying this is a public health issue. You know, we're worried about increased adolescent use. But again, you know, that's not sexy enough for the media. You know, it just doesn't, you know, a Marley brand cigarette is much sexier than what page 1037 of the proceeds of the last AMA meeting says about marijuana. And also, I mean, the folks, the scientists that are involved, they're scientists. They're not PR specialists. You know, they're not political hacks trying to figure out what the talking points should be to get them into the news. If you're a scientist, you're trying to get in a peer-reviewed journal that, you know, 12 people in the world read. That's what you're trying to do. No offense, I try to do that too. But the issue is, your goal is not to get on the front page of the New York Times. If you're in the marijuana business and you need to have buzz about your business, or you're in the legalization business and you want people to talk about the policy of legalization, your goal is to get on the front page of the New York Times, and you work on that for as long as you can. So there's this big disconnect. And so that's what Sam is trying to do, is trying to be that vehicle to bring those scientists and that scientific information into language that regular people can understand, into outlets that ordinary people would read, because it's very hard to translate that. But there isn't a lot of money to do that. That's the other issue. Yeah, and those people have an incentive to have a political advertisement and all those kinds of things because they're going to make money if this thing's legal. So that's a lot of the issue, yes.
Hypothetical situation. I'm surprised it hasn't been challenged already in courts. But let's say I have a legal prescription for medical marijuana.
Yeah.
I walk into an airplane,
Yes.
a restaurant, movie theater, and what stops me from
Well, I mean, there are laws, for example, on like no smoking. I mean, a restaurant can say that you can't smoke, and that's legal. The same thing would go to marijuana. But where this gets sticky is, again, the workplace. And Michigan has had some case law around that, but also other states. Right now in Rhode Island, a woman is suing not her employer, her potential employer. She's never been hired by them, because she says she was discriminated from them when she applied for a job because she's a medical marijuana holder. And now they have to go to court. Now, whether or not that employer wins, that's going to cost them hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars in court fees. So, you know, this is a whole can of worms. But in terms of like an airplane and those things, we have set rules, right? So like pilots don't have a right to do that. You don't have a right just to bring any drug onto the plane, even if it's legal in the state. But it does present some entanglements moving forward. I think the other group to get rich off of this is going to be trial lawyers, because there's going to be a lot of court cases on.
You mentioned the E-cigs.
Yeah.
Are you saying they can, I don't know much about it, but they can smoke marijuana in them?
Yeah, well, it's not marijuana. It's a liquid vapor of marijuana that you put in this contraption,
But it has
and you inhale it. Oh yeah. The point is it makes you high.
And
Yeah,
you can't smell it.
not usually, not in some of those contraptions. Yeah.
You call it heavy use, so I'm a teenager, I'm 18, what constitutes heavy use?
Well, I mean, we would
How many
say
times a week?
you know, at least once or twice a week is happy, or you know, I would say at least 2 to 3 times a week. I think that's what the Health and Human Services would say. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add another website
Please.
to your list, and it's here in Michigan. It's called Mobilizing Michigan.
Yes. That's great. Mobilizingmichigan.com. You have great groups here in the state. I've been to this many times because of the Mobilizing Michigan campaign and other campaigns that coalitions are doing. So you guys are doing a great job of education, and keep it up. We don't know yet. That's the thing. We don't know. We'll know in 30 years when it's probably too late if what we're doing was a mistake. And again, that's what happened with tobacco is, there were early signs of the lung cancer and things like that, like we saw, but you had the whole industry saying, well, we don't really know, and that's, there are other science that says we're not sure, and we just got to wait and see. Well, we waited and saw, and we lost 50 million people in the process 25 years later. So I'm worried that we're sort of repeating that same mistake because, of course, not all the science is ever going to be as definitive as some people want. So, this high-potency marijuana, these 95% concentrates, the average 15, 17% THC, that's all very new. And the vaporizing, that's all very new. So, yeah, we'll find out. Check back in 30 years.
I just wanted to make a small clarification. In states that have passed medical marijuana laws, the FDA prohibits physicians from prescribing smoked marijuana.
That's right.
And these states allow.
That's right. Recommend.
And the physician still cannot prescribe.
That's right.
Because the FDA does not permit it.
That's exactly right. You can't prescribe an illegal drug, so it's authorized or recommended is what a lot of the, I don't know if that's the language you use in Michigan, maybe use authorized, but a lot of states use recommended. And so it's not a prescription. It's not a thing on the prescription pad. It can't be.
Any other questions?
Deep in the corner. Ooh. Yeah. Well, not it's okay, it's a fine. You're removing the criminal penalty, which I never thought was there in the first place. So it was there in the first place? Okay. So you're removing the criminal penalty, it becomes like a misdemeanor or a violation? Civil infraction. It's like a parking speeding ticket? It's like a speeding ticket.
Okay, there's one over here.
Is part of your SAM organization,
Yeah.
I mean, have you done that video at the very end was very enlightening?
Yes.
And are you using the same kind of tactics to get the Surgeon General to claim this to be?
Yeah, we're trying, but frankly, and this is where I got the pitch for funding. We're all voluntary. Most of us are volunteers. My income comes from speaking in different venues. I'll be in speaking 6 times in 48 hours.
Hopefully someplace warmer.
Well, if I can get there, Atlanta tomorrow, and then that evening, Philadelphia. But mainly volunteers, and we take voluntary donations. We don't take government money or anything. So it's just difficult. But we are trying to do this in D.C. There's the legalization movement has targeted Capitol Hill in D.C. and they want to do more things there. So we're trying to maybe become more active there and get going. But it's difficult. Yeah.
Do you need the mic?
I'm probably pretty loud, so you probably don't. No matter what we do here, whether we keep it illegal, do medical use for it, a common thread, I think, through all 3 of these is education about what uses are going to do, especially for our youth. Is there anybody that's coming up with a protocol that we can go into a community and say, we want to get into the schools,
Yeah.
and we don't want old people telling kids because they're not going to young people telling kids. Is there something that
There's not it's not great. There is not great stuff out there on marijuana. Now this website that
may expand beyond
Yeah.
marijuana, prescription medication.
Yeah, prescription.
They think those are safe.
they sure do because they're medicine after all, right? Which so is marijuana. It's medicine. How can it be bad? Opiates. It's prescribed. How can they be bad? There aren't a lot of great education resources. There is a website, samhsa.gov, SAMHSA, that talks about programs that have been like peer-reviewed and gone through some kind of rigor to be on a list. They have a national registry of prevention practices, but there's not a lot. What you saw is a group not affiliated with us, actually, called Adventi, and you can actually buy that video. It's EDVENTI. Adventi is going to begin to produce materials, I believe, to be used in, but there's not a lot out there.
I can agree with that because we've been looking for it. We're trying to figure out what makes sense because we know, and I know some of the teachers at the Coalition Youth Committee, it's very hard to come up with something effective and concise that doesn't take them away from their primary role in a classroom. So we're working on it, and as soon as we find something, we're going to utilize it. So. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I want to thank you, Kevin.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thanks so much.